What if the beginning we were taught to remember was never truly the beginning at all? History, as it is commonly told, opens its eyes late. It wakes up already standing among stones, cities, and names. It never speaks of learning to walk. It never remembers its own childhood. Between the last ice age and the first temples, there is a silence so wide it almost feels intentional. A long, breath-held pause where nothing is supposed to have happened, and yet something clearly did. There are moments when absence becomes heavier than evidence, when what is missing presses more firmly against the mind than what remains. Entire stretches of human existence, tens of thousands of years, are reduced to a few cautious paragraphs framed as slow, primitive, uneventful. But the earth itself does not remember us that way. The ground carries scars, the ice remembers sudden melting, the oceans keep the taste of chaos in their chemistry. Civilizations, we are told, rise once. They advance forward. They do not loop. They do not reset. And yet, across geology, mythology, and forgotten records, a different rhythm quietly repeats. A pulse that seems to return every 12,000 years, give or take a breath of time. A rhythm that does not ask for permission. Long before cities had names, before writing pinned thought to clay, something ended. Not gradually, not politely. Temperatures spiked, ice sheets collapsed, species vanished with terrifying speed. The world rearranged itself as if shaken awake, and when the dust settled, memory did not survive intact. Only fragments drifted forward, stories of floods, of fire from the sky, of gods departing, of ages that were before. If civilizations have fallen before, they did not leave us warnings carved in stone. They left us gaps, interruptions, unfinished sentences scattered across continents and cultures that should never have known each other, yet somehow tell the same dream. And before you allow your body to sink completely into this comfort, take a very small moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if there is something in what I'm saying that makes you want to stay a little longer. If you wish, share the place and time where you're listening. I am always curious about the small points of light drifting together tonight. What remains unsettling is not the idea that something was lost, but the possibility that loss itself is part of a cycle, that forgetting is not an accident but a function. Each time the world resets, memory thins, language simplifies, history begins again, pretending nothing came before. If this rhythm is real, then our civilization may not be standing on a straight line of progress, but on a ring, and rings by their nature bring you back to places you once believed were behind you. The question is not whether civilizations have ended before. The question is whether this one understands what comes next. The number itself does not announce its presence loudly. It slips through records quietly, appearing where disciplines rarely speak to one another. 12,000 years is not a date etched into monuments or chanted in myths with precision. Instead, it emerges as a rhythm, a spacing between disruptions, a recurring distance between deep fractures in the story the Earth tells about itself. In the layers of ice pulled from Greenland and Antarctica, time is arranged like breath held and released. For tens of thousands of years, climate drifts slowly, predictably. Then, without warning, the pattern breaks. Temperatures surge upward in decades, not millennia. Dust levels spike. Atmospheric chemistry shifts. These abrupt transitions feel less like evolution and more like interruption. Among them, one stands out with an unsettling clarity. The end of the Younger Dryas, roughly 11,600 years ago. Before that moment, the world was colder. Vast ice sheets pressed down on continents, reshaping coastlines and locking oceans into place. Then something changed, quickly. Glaciers retreated at a pace that defies gradualism. Sea levels rose violently. Entire ecosystems were erased before adaptation could catch up. Whatever humanity was becoming at that moment was forced to adapt not to slow change, but to catastrophe. The Earth's axis does not stand still. It wobbles slowly like a spinning top losing balance. This motion, axial precession, completes a full cycle roughly every 26,000 years. Half of that cycle, approximately 13,000 years, marks a reversal in the timing of seasons relative to Earth's position around the Sun. It is during these thresholds that climate instability becomes more likely. Solar radiation redistributes, ice sheets weaken, feedback loops awaken. The 12,000-year interval begins to feel less arbitrary when seen through this lens, not as a fixed schedule, but as a window, a vulnerable phase where small triggers can cascade into planetary upheaval. Volcanism, ocean circulation shifts, cosmic impacts, or solar fluctuations would all strike harder during such moments. The Earth does not need intention to reset itself. It only needs imbalance. What complicates the picture is that human memory seems to echo these geological rhythms. Across cultures separated by oceans and epochs, stories emerge of a world destroyed by water, fire, or darkness, followed by renewal. These myths do not read like distant allegory. They carry trauma. They describe survivors, not creators. They speak of rebuilding, not inventing. Yet mainstream history prefers smooth curves. It teaches that civilization arose once, gradually, driven by agriculture, surplus, and stability. But stability is precisely what the Earth seems to withdraw at regular intervals. If humanity had already learned to organize, build, observe the skies, and shape stone before such a withdrawal, much of that knowledge would not survive the collapse of coastlines and climates. Stone endures, but context does not. Writing survives, but languages fracture. Precision dissolves first. What remains are symbols stripped of explanation, rituals remembered without understanding. When later societies encounter these remnants, they interpret them as origins, not leftovers. If a prior civilization reached even a modest level of complexity before the last climatic rupture, its disappearance would leave a misleading simplicity behind. Archaeology would find sudden beginnings because the earlier chapters were physically erased, drowned beneath rising seas, buried under sediments, or scattered beyond recognition. The timeline would appear clean because the mess was wiped away. The deeper discomfort comes from realizing that this pattern does not belong to the past alone. The same celestial mechanics continue, the same oceans circulate, the same fragile balances exist. If 12,000 years marks a recurring threshold, then modern civilization stands uncomfortably close to another crossing. Technology has not freed humanity from planetary forces. It has only delayed their consequences. Cities still rely on coastlines. Agriculture still depends on predictable seasons. Knowledge is still centralized, digitized, and vulnerable to disruption. The idea that progress guarantees permanence is a belief, not a law. What makes the cycle so difficult to accept is that it denies linear heroism. It suggests that intelligence is not immune to repetition, that collapse does not require moral failure, only timing, and that memory itself may be the first casualty, rewritten by survivors who no longer know what was lost. If this is true, then history's greatest illusion is not ignorance, but confidence. Confidence that we are unique. Confidence that we are final. Confidence that the ground beneath us will continue to cooperate simply because it has for a while. The Earth does not mark its resets with announcements. It does not warn civilizations directly. It changes its rhythm, and those who fail to notice call it coincidence. If a 12,000-year pulse has shaped the rise and disappearance of worlds before ours, then the silence in the historical record is not a mystery at all. It is the sound of forgetting, repeated so many times that forgetting itself feels normal. The unsettling thought is not that such cycles exist. It is that we may already be standing inside the next one, mistaking its early signs for noise. What unsettles researchers is not merely that something ended, but how abruptly the ending arrived. Extinction, in the human imagination, often unfolds slowly, species fading over long ages, cultures declining across generations. Yet the record etched into stone, bone, and ice speaks in sharper tones. It describes moments when the living world did not drift towards silence, but fell into it. At the close of the last ice age, large animals vanished across multiple continents almost simultaneously. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats. Creatures that had survived countless climatic oscillations disappeared within a geological blink. The timing aligns closely with the climatic convulsions surrounding the Younger Dryas. This was not a gentle transition. It was a rupture. In Greenland ice cores, scientists observed temperature increases of up to 10 degrees Celsius occurring within a few decades. Not centuries, not millennia, decades. Such speed leaves little room for adaptation. Ecosystems collapse not because they are weak, but because they are unprepared. Forests retreat, grasslands shift, migration routes dissolve, and for any species dependent on stability, including humans, survival becomes improvisation. What makes this interval especially strange is the layering of stressors. Rising temperatures alone do not explain the sudden darkness recorded in sediments, the spikes in atmospheric dust, or the traces of widespread burning found across continents. Charcoal layers appear where forests should not have burned so extensively. Meltwater floods reshape river systems overnight. Sea levels rise not gradually, but in pulses, swallowing coastlines and forcing populations inland. Some researchers have pointed toward cosmic factors, evidence of increased platinum concentrations, microscopic spherules, and nanodiamonds in boundary layers suggest the possibility of extraterrestrial impacts or airbursts. Not a single civilization-ending asteroid, but fragmented encounters, enough to ignite fires, disrupt climate, and destabilize already fragile ice sheets. The sky itself may have become an accomplice. Others argue for internal Earth systems reaching critical thresholds, the collapse of ice dams releasing glacial lakes, the shutdown and restart of ocean circulation, massive freshwater injections altering global climate patterns. These mechanisms require no intention, no external trigger, only accumulation. The Earth, like any complex system, tolerates imbalance until it cannot. For humans living through such a moment, there would be no clear explanation, only cascading effects. Familiar lands drowned, game animals vanished, seasonal knowledge failed. Oral traditions would carry memories of fire falling from the sky, of waters rising without warning, of cold returning suddenly after warmth. These are not scientific reports, they are survival narratives. What is rarely discussed is how selective survival would have been. Knowledge tied to fragile infrastructure, writing, metallurgy, precise measurement, would vanish first. Skills embedded in bodies and rituals might persist longer. Navigation by stars, stone shaping. Symbolic memory encoded in myth rather than data. What survives a collapse is not what is most advanced, but what is most portable. If any organized societies existed before this rupture, their disappearance would not resemble a fall from greatness. It would look like abandonment. Cities left unfinished. Quarries deserted mid-cut. Monuments repurposed or buried. The archaeological record would interpret absence as non-existence, mistaking erasure for simplicity. Even today, our understanding of extinction events remains partial. We describe causes but rarely experience their speed. We analyze layers but do not feel the panic embedded in them. The animals that vanished did not slowly lose relevance. They were present, and then they were not. The land learned a new shape without asking permission. This pattern, sudden environmental stress followed by biological and cultural thinning, repeats deeper in time. At the end of the last ice age, it coincides uncannily with a reset in human complexity. Afterward, agriculture emerges rapidly. Monumental construction appears sooner than expected. Symbolic systems bloom. It is as though humanity was not inventing from nothing, but reassembling from memory fragments. What if extinction is not merely an ending, but a filter, a narrowing of possibility that determines which knowledge passes forward and which dissolves? In that sense, catastrophe does not erase civilization uniformly. It edits it. It decides what can be remembered. The modern world studies these past disruptions with distance, comforted by the belief that we would see the next one coming. Satellites watch the skies. Sensors measure the seas. Models predict trends. But prediction does not guarantee prevention. Awareness does not grant immunity. The same processes that reshaped the Earth before continue quietly beneath familiar routines. What remains haunting is the realization that those who lived through the last great rupture likely believed themselves stable shortly before it arrived. They had adapted to cold, they had survived hardship, they had reason to trust continuity. And then continuity broke. If extinction events are punctuation marks rather than full stops, moments where life continues but meaning resets, then the silence they leave behind is deceptive. It hides not emptiness, but compression. Entire histories pressed thin, reduced to symbols waiting to be misread. The Earth does not destroy indiscriminately, it reshapes, and in doing so, it decides which stories remain loud enough to be heard. The question that lingers is not whether sudden endings have happened before, it is whether recognizing their pattern changes anything before the next silence arrives. The problem does not begin with what was built, but with when it was built. Time in archaeology is supposed to behave. It should move forward politely, with tools preceding monuments, and complexity emerging only after a long rehearsal. Yet there are places where time appears to have arrived early, standing fully formed where it should not yet exist. Göbekli Tepe rests on a high limestone ridge in southeastern Anatolia, exposed not by conquest or legend, but by accident. What first appeared as a scatter of stones revealed itself, slowly, to be something else entirely. Circles of towering pillars carved with animals that seem to move even in stillness. Each pillar weighs many tons. Each was quarried, shaped, transported, and erected with care. The geometry is intentional. The symbolism is layered. The effort is undeniable. The accepted date unsettles everything. More than 11,000 years ago. Before pottery, before metal, before agriculture, according to the conventional sequence. A time when humans are expected to be wandering, small in number, concerned primarily with survival. And yet here stands architecture that requires planning, coordination, labour specialisation, and above all, purpose. The site does not feel experimental. There is no hesitation in its design. The carvings are confident, as though the language of stone was already fluent. The animals depicted, foxes, snakes, birds, bulls, are not random decorations. They repeat, they interact, they suggest a symbolic grammar that is no longer accessible to us. Whatever was being expressed here, it was already mature. Even more troubling than the construction is the burial. After centuries of use, the structures were deliberately filled in, not destroyed, not abandoned to erosion, buried carefully beneath layers of soil and debris, preserving them for millennia. This act does not resemble collapse, it resembles closure, as if those who built the site knew it would not remain visible, and ensured that it would wait. The question arises quietly. Wait for whom? If Göbekli Tepe represents the dawn of civilization, it is a strange dawn indeed, one that begins with temples rather than homes, ritual before farming, meaning before subsistence. But if it represents something else, a remnant, a reconstruction, a memory encoded in stone, then its strangeness begins to make sense. After the climatic chaos at the end of the Younger Dryas, survivors would have faced a world rearranged beyond recognition. coastlines erased, resources redistributed, social structures fractured. In such a world, what would be rebuilt first? Shelter is necessary, but memory is urgent. Identity demands anchors. Ritual stabilizes trauma. A place where meaning can be reassembled might precede the rebuilding of daily life. Göbekli Tepe does not speak of origin. It speaks of return. There is no evidence of permanent habitation nearby. No houses clustered around the pillars. No refuse layers thick with everyday life. People came here from elsewhere, gathered, performed something, and left. The site functioned as a focal point, not a settlement. This suggests an already existing network of groups capable of coordination across distance and time. The knowledge required to orient structures, to carve reliefs with consistent style, to source and transport stone, does not emerge spontaneously. It accumulates. It is taught. And teaching implies continuity, a chain that must extend further back than the site itself. Archaeology struggles with beginnings because beginnings rarely survive intact. What survives are interruptions. Göbekli Tepe interrupts the story we tell ourselves about progress. It refuses to sit quietly at the start of the timeline. It demands explanation without offering comfort. Some have attempted to resolve the tension by redefining civilization, by suggesting that monument building does not require complexity. That ritual can exist without hierarchy. That cooperation can arise briefly without structure. These arguments are not impossible, but they feel incomplete. They describe how something might happen, not why it did. The site's astronomical alignments add another layer of unease. Certain pillars appear oriented towards specific celestial events. If correct, this implies sustained observation of the sky, pattern recognition across generations, and symbolic interpretation of cosmic cycles. This is not the behavior of a species newly awakened to abstraction. It is the behavior of a mind remembering something it once knew. When placed within the broader pattern, climatic reset, extinction, sudden reorganization, Göbekli Tepe reads less like a first step and more like a foothold. A place where fragments of an older understanding were anchored into stone before they could dissolve completely. What followed is equally telling. After the site was buried, agriculture appears in the region not long after. Domestication accelerates. Permanent settlements emerge. Civilization, as we recognize it, unfolds rapidly. It is tempting to interpret this as cause and effect, ritual giving rise to stability. But it may also be inheritance, the final release of stored knowledge once conditions allowed. If this interpretation feels unsettling, it is because it suggests that humanity does not always invent its future from scratch. Sometimes it recovers it. Göbekli Tepe does not answer questions, it rearranges them. It asks why memory appears suddenly fully formed after catastrophe. It asks why people would bury their greatest work unless they believed it was no longer meant for the present. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it asks whether similar footholds exist elsewhere. Waiting beneath sediments, beneath water, beneath assumptions, reminders of previous crossings through collapse. If civilizations do reset, then places like this are not anomalies. They are messages. Not warnings carved in words, but pauses preserved in stone. The question is not whether we will find more such sites. It is whether we will recognize them for what they are, before time buries us as carefully as they once buried their past. Some memories do not survive as structures. They slip instead into ink, into parchment, into the fragile hands of copyists who may not fully understand what they are preserving. Maps belong to this quieter category of remembrance. They are supposed to describe what is known, not what has been forgotten, and yet there are maps that seem to know too much too soon. In the early 16th century, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis compiled a chart of the world using older sources. The surviving fragment shows coastlines rendered with an unsettling confidence. Africa curves southward with accuracy. South America appears with proportions that would not be verified for centuries. And at the southern edge, a landmass stretches beneath the Atlantic, a shape that some have argued resembles Antarctica, depicted without ice. This alone would be curious, but not alarming. Map-making often improves unevenly. What disturbs historians is not the map itself, but the sources Piri Reis claimed to have used. He wrote of ancient charts, some inherited from earlier civilizations, some copied from libraries no longer standing. He did not present his work as discovery, but as compilation. Antarctica, according to conventional history, was not officially sighted until the 19th century. Its coastline beneath the ice was not mapped until the 20th, using radar and seismic surveys, and yet several early maps, Piri Reis among them, but not alone, suggest a southern continent drawn with detail inconsistent with guesswork. Orontius Phineus, in the 16th century, depicted a large southern landmass complete with rivers and mountain ranges. Filippo Boace later proposed Antarctica divided by waterways, a notion confirmed only centuries afterward. These maps do not agree perfectly. They do not need to. Memory degrades. Copies distort. But the pattern persists. Knowledge appearing earlier than expected, then vanishing, then reappearing. Like a signal fading in and out of clarity. If Antarctica was once mapped without ice, the implications are profound. Ice cores tell us that parts of the continent were ice-free far earlier than the last ice age, more than 12,000 years ago, before the Younger Dryas, before the most recent climatic rupture. At a time when sea levels were lower and coastlines extended farther into what is now ocean. Mapping such a world would require not only exploration but sustained observation, accurate latitude measurement, an understanding of projection, a reason to chart lands beyond immediate survival. These are not the marks of scattered hunter-gatherers improvising in isolation. They belong to a culture that values orientation, not just geographically but cosmologically. Skeptics argue that these interpretations are imaginative, that coastlines can be misread, that pareidolia fills in what we wish to see, and they are right to caution restraint, but restraint does not erase the discomfort of coincidence. When multiple maps from different regions and traditions echo similar anomalies, coincidence begins to thin. What if these charts are not predictions but recollections, not visions of future discovery but echoes of past familiarity? Knowledge carried forward through collapse, compressed into fragments, resurfacing when conditions allowed. Maps, after all, are tools of memory. They encode relationships between land and sea, between stars and horizons. Even when their makers forget why certain features matter, the shapes persist. A coastline drawn once may be copied long after its meaning fades. There is another layer of quiet unease here. Many of these anomalous maps appear during periods of upheaval, the fall of empires, the rediscovery of classical texts, the reorganization of knowledge. They surface at moments when the world is rearranging itself, when old libraries are being reopened or destroyed, when fragments of the past briefly resurface before being filtered again. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria looms over this discussion not as a single event, but as a symbol. Knowledge, once centralized, becomes vulnerable. When it collapses, what survives does so unevenly. Practical texts vanish. Rituals remain. Maps may endure because they are useful even when misunderstood. If prior civilizations possessed advanced geographic knowledge, their collapse would not erase that knowledge instantly. It would scatter it. Some fragments would drift east, others west, most would decay. A few would be copied by hands that no longer knew their origin, preserving accuracy without context. This would explain why such maps feel orphaned. They do not belong comfortably to the eras that transmit them. They appear as guests from another time, tolerated but not integrated. Historians classify them as curiosities rather than signals, but curiosity has weight. It bends narratives. It refuses to be fully explained away. The idea that humanity may have mapped the world before the last major climatic reset reframes our sense of progress. It suggests that exploration does not necessarily move forward in a straight line, that some horizons are crossed, then forgotten, then crossed again. In this light, the age of discovery becomes less of a beginning and more of a rediscovery, a re-expansion into spaces once known under different skies, ships retracing routes memory barely remembered, maps waking from sleep. What remains haunting is the silence between these awakenings, the centuries where knowledge sleeps, waiting for conditions to stabilize enough to be used again, waiting for seas to calm, for climates to settle, for civilizations to believe themselves permanent once more. If civilization resets, then maps are among the quietest survivors. They do not tell stories, they do not warn, they simply show what once was, without insisting on belief. And perhaps that is why they unsettle us so deeply, because they suggest that the world we think we are discovering has already been seen, and that seeing it did not prevent its loss. The question that lingers is not whether ancient maps are accurate. It is why the knowledge they hint at was allowed to disappear, and whether our own maps will one day be misread the same way. Long before geology learned to speak in layers and isotopes, humanity told its history in water, not as measurement, but as memory. Again and again, across cultures that never shared a language or a coastline, the same story surfaces with minor variations. A world undone by rising seas, a cleansing flood that arrives not gradually, but with judgmental speed. What is remarkable is not the existence of flood myths. Rivers overflow, storms destroy. Such stories are inevitable. What is unsettling is their scale. These are not local disasters magnified by imagination. They describe totality, the end of an age, the erasure of almost everyone, survival granted to a few who carry seeds, animals, tools, laws or names into a quieter future. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh speaks of Utnapishtim, warned in advance, instructed to preserve life as waters swallow the land. In Hebrew tradition, Noah receives a similar burden. In Hindu texts, Manu is guided through a deluge that resets the world. Greek myth remembers Deucalion and Pyrrha. Indigenous traditions from the Americas to Australia echo the same loss: land submerged, ancestors scattered, time divided into before and after. These narratives are often dismissed as allegory, moral instruction dressed as catastrophe. But allegory does not require consistency across continents. Allegory does not demand precise environmental details. The suddenness of the water, the darkness, the cold that follows, the silence after. When myth is compared to climate data, something curious emerges. The end of the last ice age was not a single smooth melt, but a series of pulses. Meltwater surged into the oceans. Sea levels rose by meters within human lifetimes. Coastal plains, where early populations likely concentrated, vanished beneath expanding shorelines. Entire ways of life would have been drowned without leaving stone behind. For those who survived inland or at higher elevations, the loss would have felt total. Familiar routes gone, sacred sites submerged. The dead unrecoverable, memory itself threatened by displacement. In such conditions, the mind does not record data, it records trauma. Flood myths carry the emotional signature of survivors. They do not celebrate progress. They grieve. They warn. They speak of arrogance punished, of imbalance corrected, of forces beyond negotiation. Whether gods or nature are blamed matters less than the underlying message. The world can reset itself without consent. What is often overlooked is what follows the flood in these stories. Rebuilding, relawing, renaming. Humanity does not begin from ignorance. It resumes from fragments. Agriculture is taught again. Calendars re-established. Sacred knowledge handed down selectively. Civilization restarts, but altered. Thinner, simpler, constrained. If such myths preserve memory rather than invention, then they may represent humanity's most enduring archive. Not of events as they happened, but of events as they were felt. A record of interruption so severe that it fractured continuity. There is also an uncomfortable uniformity in how these stories position humanity. Survivors are not heroes by merit. They are chosen, warned, or merely lucky. Survival is not framed as achievement, but as burden. The task is not conquest, but remembrance. This framing aligns disturbingly well with what a true global reset would demand. After catastrophic sea level rise, scattered human groups would rebuild with diminished resources and partial knowledge. The past would feel immense and unreachable. Stories would stretch to fill the gap where records were lost. As centuries pass, myth would harden. The flood becomes divine. Survivors become ancestors of all. Complexity is moralized. What was once environmental becomes ethical. History simplifies because complexity no longer serves survival. Yet simplification leaves residue. Common symbols persist. Boats, mountains, pairs of animals, seeds, tablets. Each appears too frequently to be coincidence. These are not random motifs. They are survival priorities remembered symbolically. Modern science, in its effort to separate myth from fact, often strips these stories of their weight. But memory does not care about categories. Trauma compresses experience into narrative. What matters is not accuracy, but preservation. If civilization truly resets on a planetary scale, then flood myths are not explanations. They're echoes. The sound a memory makes when it has lost its language, and echoes by nature repeat. There is a deeper unease in realizing that these stories are not warnings of a single past event, but reflections of recurrence. Many traditions speak of multiple ages, multiple destructions, worlds remade again and again. The flood is not unique, it is expected. This expectation reframes our own era uncomfortably. Rising seas are no longer theoretical. Coastlines retreat quietly, without myth or ceremony. Data replaces story, and yet the emotional pattern remains the same: denial, adaptation, displacement. What if the ancient storytellers were not primitive mythmakers, but careful archivists of catastrophe? What if they encoded the most important lesson they had learned, that civilization is fragile not because humans are flawed, but because the earth is dynamic? If that lesson has been told to us for thousands of years, whispered through bedtime stories and sacred texts alike, then forgetting it is not innocence, it is repetition. The flood does not need to come from rain alone. Ice melts, oceans expand, land sinks, water always finds the low places. The question that drifts uneasily beneath these myths is not whether they describe something that already happened. It is whether they were meant to remind us that it happens again, and again, and again. There is a moment in the historical record where numbers stop behaving, where time stretches beyond the scale of human memory and refuses to return quietly to proportion. It appears without preface, embedded in a document that looks, at first glance, administrative rather than mythical. A list of kings, cities, and reigns preserved on clay. The Sumerian king list does not open with metaphor. It opens with order. Kingship descends from the heavens, it says, and settles into specific places. Names are given, cities are named, and then the numbers appear. Reigns lasting tens of thousands of years. Alulim rules for 28,800 years. His successors govern for similarly impossible spans. 8 kings reign for a combined total that stretches beyond 200,000 years. This is usually where modern readers stop listening. The numbers are dismissed as symbolic, exaggerated, mythic shorthand for importance rather than duration. And perhaps they are. But dismissal is not explanation, especially when the list itself does something curious. It separates time. There is a before and an after, a moment where the text says simply that a great flood swept over the land, and when it passes, kingship returns, diminished. Reigns shrink from tens of thousands of years to lifetimes that resemble our own. The list does not suggest gradual change. It does not ease into realism. It resets. What matters here is not whether those early reigns were literal years as we count them. What matters is that the scribes who preserved this text believed there was a fundamental break in time, a rupture so complete that it altered the nature of leadership, longevity, and continuity itself. The flood functions as a divider, not just of land, but of scale. Before it, time behaves differently. After it, the world resembles something more familiar. This pattern mirrors what geology and climatology suggest, that the end of the last ice age was not simply warmer, but categorically different. A shift not only in environment, but in possibility. The Sumerians were not naive record keepers. They distinguished myth from administration elsewhere. They tracked trade, astronomy, taxation, and ritual with precision. That they chose to preserve these impossible reigns in the same format as later. Plausible ones suggest intention. The past was not discarded. It was bracketed. One way to interpret the early kings is as gods. Another is as dynasties compressed into single names. Another still is symbolic numerology. Each explanation attempts to rescue the timeline from embarrassment, but none address why the list insists on continuity, why it presents pre-flood and post-flood kingship as the same institution, altered by catastrophe rather than replaced. If the list is read as memory rather than measurement, it begins to change shape. Long reigns could represent stability so extended it felt endless, or time counted differently, marked by cycles no longer relevant, or leadership that spanned generations, remembered as singular because continuity mattered more than individuality. After a planetary reset, survivors would inherit fragments of older chronologies without the context to translate them. Timekeeping systems tied to celestial cycles, now disrupted by axial changes or climate instability, would lose precision. What once meant something exact would become ceremonial. The Sumerian king list may not be lying. It may be misremembering honestly. What deepens the unease is how closely this memory aligns with other resets. The flood appears again, civilization resumes again, kingship descends again, but weakened. Humanity is still organized, still symbolic, but no longer vast. Something has been lost even if its name remains. The text does not mourn this loss. It does not explain it. It records it and moves on. This emotional restraint is telling. Trauma often produces silence rather than commentary. What cannot be fixed is not argued with. It is accepted. Later civilizations inherited these stories without fully understanding them. Gods replace ancestors. Myth absorbs memory. Longevity becomes divinity because normal human scales can no longer hold what was remembered. Over time, literal interpretation becomes dangerous, so allegory steps in to protect coherence. But allegory does not erase origin. It conceals it. If civilization resets, then lists like this are not errors. They are fossils of timekeeping, remnants of a world that counted existence differently. Before catastrophe, forced compression. The past becomes impossibly long because it no longer fits inside the present. Modern scholarship often asks whether these stories are true. A better question may be whether they are incomplete, because if humanity has passed through multiple cycles of rise and erasure, then each cycle would shorten memory. Each reset would thin the record further. What survives would appear absurd, exaggerated or symbolic. Not because it is false, but because it has lost its units. The Sumerian scribes may have been preserving the last coherent echo of a much longer human story, one that no longer aligned with the scale of their world, but still demanded inclusion. If that is the case, then the list is not about kings. It is about time itself, broken, reassembled, and quietly misunderstood. The unsettling thought is not that ancient people believed impossible things. It is that they may have been trying to remember something we no longer know how to measure. After every rupture, something survives. Not everything, never everything, but enough to shape what comes next. The question is not whether knowledge endures, but how it chooses its vessels. Stone cracks, paper burns, memory adapts. In the long shadows that follow collapse, it is rarely the builders who preserve the past. It is the watchers, the recorders. Those whose power lies not in shaping the world, but in observing it quietly, patiently, while it breaks. Across history, moments of civilizational fracture are followed by the sudden importance of small inward-facing communities, monasteries, temples, scholarly enclaves, groups that withdraw rather than expand. Their survival strategy is not dominance, but continuity. They copy, they recite, they simplify. They decide what is worth carrying forward when everything else is too heavy. When empires fall, it is often these marginal figures who inherit the debris of meaning. After Rome fractured, monastic scribes preserved fragments of classical knowledge while cities burned and roads collapsed. They did not preserve everything. They could not. Choices were made, sometimes consciously, sometimes by necessity. What survived shaped the next world. What was lost became myth. This pattern is older than Christianity, older than writing itself. In ancient India, oral transmission guarded the Vedas with astonishing precision across millennia, not by writing them down, but by embedding them into ritual and sound. In Mesopotamia, scribes trained for years to copy tablets exactly, preserving administrative, astronomical, and mythological records long after the societies that birthed them were gone. But preservation is never neutral. Knowledge that survives catastrophe often does so by changing shape. Mathematics becomes numerology. Astronomy becomes astrology. Engineering becomes sacred geometry. Practical instruction dissolves into symbol, because symbol travels farther. Symbol survives where manuals do not. This is why so much ancient knowledge appears frustratingly incomplete. We encounter remnants, alignments without equations, calendars without context, myths without instructions. We assume primitivism where there may have been compression. The guardians of knowledge are not villains, they are filters. They choose what can be remembered without destabilizing a fragile present. After collapse, society is not ready for complexity. It needs coherence. It needs story more than precision. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria lingers as a cautionary silhouette, not because it was a single moment of loss, but because it represents vulnerability. Centralized knowledge concentrates risk. When it falls, the loss is catastrophic and uneven. What survives does so elsewhere, in fragments, in translations, in echoes. Later institutions learned from this vulnerability. Knowledge was distributed, hidden, encoded. Some texts were copied obsessively, others were quietly excluded. Orthodoxy became a survival mechanism. Not all truths are allowed to persist if they threaten order during reconstruction. This is where suspicion enters the story. If civilization resets periodically, then institutions that survive resets would accumulate quiet influence. They would not control the world openly. They would control memory. By deciding which past is allowed to exist, they shape the future without needing to predict it. This does not require conspiracy. It requires continuity. Religious institutions, in particular, excel at this form of temporal stewardship. They think in centuries. They preserve ritual across generations. They understand that belief stabilizes societies in ways information alone cannot. When faced with remnants of an older world that do not fit emerging frameworks, the response is rarely destruction. It is reinterpretation. Pagan temples become churches. Ancient gods become saints. Calendars are rewritten, but festivals remain. The past is not erased, it is renamed. In this way, memory is never fully lost, it is layered. What troubles researchers is not that knowledge was filtered, but that the filters themselves persist invisibly. We inherit conclusions without seeing the process that produced them. We trust timelines shaped by institutions whose priority was survival, not completeness. If there were prior cycles of civilization, then some groups may have learned to anticipate collapse. They would understand that visibility is dangerous, that overt technological continuity invites destruction. What survives must appear humble, symbolic, incomplete. The most durable knowledge would be that which looks harmless. Star cycles encoded as myth, geological memory hidden in flood stories, advanced observation disguised as astrology, engineering principles buried in sacred proportion. The future reads them as superstition, unaware that superstition was the camouflage. The unsettling implication is that the past may not be as silent as it seems. It may be speaking constantly, but in a language we have been trained not to take seriously. Modern civilization prides itself on transparency. Data is open. Archives are digital. Knowledge is democratized. But centralization has returned in new forms. Servers replace libraries. Algorithms replace scribes. Memory is efficient but brittle. If another reset comes, climatic, cosmic, or systemic, what will survive will not be what is most advanced. It will be what is most adaptable. What can be remembered without infrastructure? What can be whispered, sung, carved, or ritualized? The guardians of the next memory may not be scientists. They may be storytellers, monks of a different kind, archivists of feeling rather than fact. If history truly moves in cycles, then knowledge is never destroyed outright. It is thinned, filtered, simplified until it fits through catastrophe. The question is not who controls history. The question is who survives long enough to remember it, and what they choose to leave behind when remembering everything becomes impossible. There are stones that refuse to behave like ruins. They do not look broken enough, they do not look confused by time. They sit where they are as if the world shifted around them, not the other way around. When people encounter such places, the unease is immediate, not because they are beautiful, but because they feel out of place in the story we tell ourselves about when skill is supposed to appear. At Puma Punku, blocks of andesite and sandstone lie scattered like the remains of something dismantled with intention. The cuts are precise. The angles repeat with machine-like consistency. Grooves align across separate stones as if they were once parts of a single system. The scale is not monumental in height, but in tolerance. These are not rough megaliths stacked by brute force. They are components. No written language survives to explain them. No transitional prototypes lead toward them. They appear complete, then disappear from the record. Archaeology struggles not because the stones are impossible, but because they are inconvenient. They suggest a level of planning and standardization that does not fit comfortably into the accepted timeline of the region. Thousands of kilometers away at Baalbek, the so-called trilithon stones rest beneath later Roman construction. Each weighs hundreds of tons. They were quarried, transported, and set with astonishing precision. The Romans built atop them, not because they could not remove them, but because they could not improve upon their placement. The foundation predates the empire that inherited it. These sites are often treated separately, as isolated marvels explained by local ingenuity or lost techniques. But their shared characteristics whisper a different possibility. Massive stonework, extreme precision, lack of intermediate development, and most telling of all, an absence of narrative. No inscriptions boasting of achievement, no clear cultural fingerprints claiming ownership. When civilizations rise gradually, they leave trails. Tool marks evolve, styles change. Methods improve visibly, but these places appear as if dropped into the timeline, fully formed, then abandoned, as if they belonged to a chapter torn from the book. Some proposed that such structures were ceremonial, symbolic rather than functional. That precision served ritual, not engineering. But ritual does not require tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. Symbolism does not demand stone so carefully fitted that even modern blades struggle to pass between joints. These are solutions to practical problems: stability, alignment, longevity. Longevity, perhaps, was the point. Stone outlasts climate. It survives fire, flood, and neglect. If one wished to leave something behind after a reset, stone would be the medium of choice. But not just any stone. Stone shaped in a way that resists misunderstanding. Blocks that interlock. Patterns that repeat. Methods that can be rediscovered, but not easily surpassed. It is tempting to imagine advanced tools, lost technologies, vanished machines. But the more unsettling possibility is simpler, that the knowledge required to shape stone so precisely is not exotic, merely organized, that it demands time, continuity, and the expectation that the future will matter. If prior civilizations faced collapse, they may have chosen what to preserve carefully. Writing fades, metal corrodes, stone remembers. But stone cannot explain itself. It can only endure. This endurance creates tension with the cultures that follow. Later societies encounter these remnants without context. They repurpose them, mythologize them, build atop them. The original intent dissolves. Ownership becomes symbolic rather than factual. The builders become giants, or gods, or lost races conveniently removed from human lineage. Anything to avoid the discomfort of inheritance, because inheritance implies responsibility. If these stones were left intentionally, they were not meant to impress. They were meant to persist, to anchor memory in matter when memory itself could not be trusted. Their silence is not ignorance, it is restraint. The global distribution of such sites deepens the mystery. Similar construction principles appear in regions with no acknowledged contact. Polygonal masonry in South America, Cyclopean walls in the Mediterranean, precision stonework in Asia, different styles, same obsession with fit. This does not require a single global civilization. It requires shared priorities, a recognition, learned perhaps through failure, that collapse is not hypothetical, that what survives must be heavy, quiet, and difficult to erase. Modern civilization builds for efficiency, for speed, for replacement. We assume continuity. Ancient builders at these sites appear to have assumed interruption. Their work anticipates abandonment. It expects neglect. It is not fragile. What makes these places so unsettling is not what they prove, but what they imply about mindset. A society that builds this way is thinking beyond its own lifespan. It is thinking beyond disaster. It is thinking about being forgotten and leaving something behind anyway. Archaeology often asks how these stones were moved. A quieter question is why they were moved at all. If civilization resets, then such structures are not anomalies. They are residues of foresight, messages without language, proof that someone at some point expected the world to break and chose stone as their witness. The tragedy is that stone remembers without speaking. We project our limitations onto it. We measure what we think is possible, then force the past to comply. In doing so, we may be misreading the most important evidence not as warning, but as curiosity. Perhaps these places were never meant to be understood immediately. Perhaps they were meant to wait until a civilization capable of questioning its own permanence encountered them again. If so, then their greatest function is not historical, it is reflective. They ask us silently whether we build as if we expect to remain, and if we do not, whether we are already preparing without admitting it for the same disappearance that seems to follow every great age before us. There is a pause in the human story that does not announce itself with catastrophe, but with acceleration, a long stretch where change is slow, uneven, and fragile, and then suddenly something shifts. tools diversify. Art becomes symbolic rather than decorative. Language deepens. Social bonds extend beyond survival. The curve bends upwards so sharply that it unsettles even those who chart it. For most of its existence, our species changed gradually. Stone tools improved incrementally. Migration followed familiar patterns, innovation appeared but rarely stayed. And then, within a surprisingly narrow window of time after the last major climatic upheaval, behaviour transformed. Not everywhere at once, but with a consistency that suggests more than coincidence. This is often called the cognitive revolution, as though the human brain abruptly rewired itself. But revolutions rarely occur without pressure, and brains do not leap forward in isolation. They respond to environment, necessity, and memory. What if this apparent leap is not the birth of something new, but the resurfacing of something interrupted? Biology does not favour sudden jumps without cause. Evolution rewards small advantages over long spans. Yet archaeological evidence suggests that symbolic thinking, complex planning, and abstract representation appear fully formed in multiple regions after periods of instability. Cave art blooms, musical instruments emerge, burial practices reflect cosmology rather than fear. The mind seems to awaken, again. Some researchers point to population growth as the catalyst. More people means more ideas, more exchange. Others emphasize climate stability, arguing that only a predictable environment allows culture to flourish. These explanations are not wrong, but they are incomplete. Stability alone does not explain why similar symbolic systems arise independently. Nor does population density account for the sudden coherence of meaning. Shared motifs, repeated geometries, mirrored myths. These patterns suggest inheritance rather than invention. If earlier cycles of civilization existed and were erased, then survivors would carry more than genes forward. They would carry habits of thought, ways of organizing reality, intuitions about order, rhythm, and symbol that could not be easily unlearned, even if their original context was gone. Memory does not live only in stories. It lives in behaviour, in what feels natural, in which questions are asked instinctively and which are never considered. A child raised among ruins does not know what they were for, but they know that something mattered enough to be built. That intuition shapes imagination. It pushes thought toward reconstruction. Trauma, too, reshapes cognition. Populations that endure catastrophe develop heightened awareness of cycles, thresholds, and risk. They encode caution into myth. They value continuity. They obsess over time. These traits would influence how intelligence expresses itself after collapse. The post-catastrophe mind does not start clean. It starts constrained. It inherits fear alongside curiosity. It learns to read signs, to watch skies, to track seasons with reverence rather than convenience. This may explain why early post-reset cultures display an almost obsessive interest in astronomy. Alignments appear everywhere. Calendars dominate ritual. Time is not background, it is sacred. When survival depends on anticipating change, the sky becomes scripture. The idea that intelligence itself resets is seductive but misleading. What resets is infrastructure, context, scale. The mind adapts to what remains. If complexity once existed and was stripped away, what follows is not ignorance, but compression. Compressed knowledge behaves strangely. It surfaces as intuition, as taboo, as myth, as art that feels meaningful before it is understood. Later generations mistake this depth for novelty, unaware that it is sediment. Modern genetics tells us that humans have not changed dramatically in tens of thousands of years. The hardware remains largely the same. What changes is software, culture, language, belief. These are fragile, they shatter easily, but fragments persist. If civilization resets, then what we call progress may simply be recovery speed. Some recover faster, some slower, some rebuild differently. The curve looks upward only because the previous descent is invisible. This reframes the question of intelligence entirely. Rather than asking when humans became modern, we might ask how many times they have had to start again. How many times meaning was rebuilt from partial memory. The unsettling possibility is that each reset trains the species to be more adaptable, but less confident. We become better at survival, but worse at remembering how close we are to forgetting. The modern world celebrates innovation while quietly fearing fragility. We sense, perhaps unconsciously, that complexity is brittle, that systems can collapse faster than they are built. This anxiety seeps into art, philosophy, and technology. It shapes our obsession with archives, backups, redundancy. These are not the habits of a species confident in permanence. They are the habits of one that has lost something before. If the mind we inherit is shaped by cycles of erasure, then our greatest leaps forward may be haunted by echoes of prior endings. Intelligence does not rise in a vacuum, it rebounds. The archaeological record cannot confirm this directly. Brains do not fossilize easily, but behavior does. And behavior suggests familiarity with loss. Perhaps that is why human creativity feels so urgent, why art appears so early, why meaning matters as much as survival. These are not luxuries, they are defenses against oblivion. If we have rebuilt ourselves before, we did not do so because we were blank. We did so because something inside us remembered that rebuilding was possible. The question that lingers is not whether intelligence can rise again after collapse. It is whether it remembers why it fell, or whether forgetting is the price of beginning once more. There are moments when history does not fade naturally, but is made to disappear. Not through time alone, but through fire, decree, and quiet decisions that never announce themselves as violence. The loss of knowledge is often imagined as accidental. Libraries burned by chance, records eroded by neglect. Yet again and again, disappearance follows power. When empires consolidate, they inherit not only land and people, but stories. Stories are dangerous when they do not align. They complicate legitimacy. They suggest alternatives. They remind the present that it is not inevitable. Throughout antiquity, centres of knowledge gathered text not because they were harmonious, but because they were numerous. The Library of Alexandria symbolized this impulse, an attempt to collect the world's memory in one place. Its destruction, whether gradual or episodic, is remembered not simply because books were lost, but because diversity of thought was narrowed. What survived elsewhere survived unevenly. Later institutions learned from this vulnerability. Knowledge was no longer merely collected, it was curated. As religion solidified, certain texts became sacred while others became dangerous. Gnostic writings vanished. Pagan philosophies were absorbed selectively. Chronologies were adjusted to fit cosmology. What did not fit was not always destroyed. Sometimes it was ignored, untranslated, or labelled heretical. Silence is often more effective than censorship. This process did not require malice, it required order. After collapse, societies crave coherence. Contradictory histories destabilize fragile identities. A single origin story is easier to defend than a tangled past. Simpler timelines are easier to teach. They anchor morality, authority, and meaning. If civilization resets, then each restart produces narrowing. Survivors do not rebuild everything. They rebuild what supports survival and unity. Complexity is postponed. Dissonance is deferred. Over time, the deferred becomes forbidden. This pattern repeats across cultures. In China, earlier dynastic records were rewritten after each consolidation. In Mesoamerica, codices were destroyed and reinterpreted through colonial lenses. In Europe, monasteries preserved classical texts selectively, favouring those that aligned with emerging theology. What disappears first is not technical skill, but alternative memory. Chronologies that suggest deeper antiquity challenge divine timelines. Technologies that hint at lost capability undermine narratives of progress. Maps that imply prior global awareness confuse discovery. These artifacts are not dangerous because they are false, but because they are ambiguous. Ambiguity invites questions. Questions erode authority. Thus, history becomes less a record of what happened, and more a framework for what is allowed to be remembered. The past is shaped not only by evidence, but by tolerance. What can be explained stays. What cannot is deferred, dismissed, or quietly shelved. Over centuries, this filtering produces a clean arc. Humanity begins humbly, advances steadily, and arrives at the present as culmination. Catastrophe becomes anomaly, collapse becomes exception. Cycles are flattened into a line, but the Earth does not move in lines. Climate oscillates. Seas rise and fall. Magnetic fields wander. Catastrophe is not rare, it is periodic. To align human history with planetary behaviour would require admitting vulnerability at the foundation. Institutions rarely do this willingly. There is also the problem of inheritance. If earlier civilizations reached advanced understanding and lost it, then modern civilization is not exceptional, merely current. This perspective undermines triumphalism. It reframes dominance as temporary. So the past is simplified, resets are smoothed, memory is thinned. The most telling losses are not those we can name, but those we cannot even guess at. Entire categories of knowledge may have vanished without leaving artifacts dramatic enough to be mourned. Navigation techniques suited to different coastlines, agricultural methods adapted to vanished climates, social systems optimized for conditions no longer present. What survives is what fits the new world. This selective survival gives the illusion of inevitability. It makes current systems feel natural, even though they are contingent. It hides the improvisation that follows collapse. It disguises adaptation as destiny. The modern age prides itself on preservation. Archives multiply. Data is mirrored across continents. But abundance can be deceptive. Digital memory is efficient but fragile. It requires energy, infrastructure, and continuity. A single systemic disruption can erase more data than centuries of fire. We believe we are better prepared because we record more, but recording is not remembering. If another reset arrives, what will endure will not be what is most comprehensive, but what is most resilient. Stories will outlast databases. Symbols will survive where files fail. Belief will travel farther than proof. This is not an argument against preservation. It is a reminder of its limits. History as we inherit it is already the product of many erasures. It feels complete because the gaps are invisible. We assume silence means nothing happened, rather than something happened that could not be carried forward. If civilization truly resets, then the greatest danger is not destruction, but certainty. The belief that our version of the past is final, that nothing meaningful lies beyond its edges. The past does not protest when it is simplified. It waits, and waiting is what it does best. The unsettling thought is not that history has been rewritten before. It is that rewriting may be the default, and that what we call truth is simply what survived the last time the world broke. There are memories that do not sit comfortably on the ground. They belong to the sky. Long before telescopes and equations, humanity looked upward not with curiosity alone, but with dependence. The heavens were not distant, they were instructional. Seasons arrived because the sky said they would. Survival followed rhythm, not hope. Across ancient cultures, an unexpected sophistication appears in how the sky was tracked. Structures align with solstices and equinoxes to the minute. Stones mark lunar standstills that repeat only every 18.5 years. Calendars anticipate eclipses decades in advance. These are not accidents. They require continuity, observation, and patience measured in generations. At places like Stonehenge, the alignment is not decorative. It is precise. The stones frame the sunrise at the solstice as though time itself were being held in place. This was not a casual act of worship. It was a record built to endure longer than memory. Similar patterns appear far from Europe. In Mesoamerica, Maya calendars tracked cycles of astonishing complexity. In ancient Egypt, temples aligned with stellar risings that shifted slowly over centuries due to precession, a phenomenon subtle enough that noticing it requires long-term observation without interruption. Precession of the equinoxes is not obvious. It unfolds over roughly 26,000 years. The stars do not change quickly. They drift almost imperceptibly. To recognize this motion, a civilization must watch the sky not for years, but for lifetimes, and trust that those observations will be continued faithfully after death. This implies something radical, an expectation of continuity beyond the individual, a belief that knowledge will be preserved, not lost, or perhaps an awareness that it once was lost and must not be again. Ancient myths often encode this celestial knowledge indirectly. Gods travel the sky. Ages are marked by constellations. Worlds end when the heavens shift. These are not poetic flourishes. They are compressed astronomy, rendered survivable through story. The idea of cosmic ages governed by stellar positions appears again and again. The Hindu yugas, the Platonic Great Year, the Mesoamerican Long Count, all describe time not as a line, but as a cycle governed by celestial mechanics. The sky becomes the clock by which civilizations measure their own impermanence. If civilization resets, then astronomy becomes a survival tool. The ground may change, seas may rise, but the sky remains, at least on human timescales. Stars offer reference points when maps are erased. Celestial cycles outlast political ones. This may explain why so much ancient architecture prioritizes alignment over comfort, why temples face stars rather than cities, why ritual calendars dominate social life. These were not superstitions, they were stabilizers. After catastrophe, when land-based markers vanish, the sky becomes the only reliable archive. There is a quiet humility embedded in this orientation. It acknowledges that humanity does not control time, it adapts to it. By anchoring meaning to celestial cycles, ancient societies aligned themselves with processes larger than any single civilization. Modern science has reclaimed this knowledge in a different language. We speak of orbital mechanics, axial tilt, Milankovitch cycles. But the underlying truth remains unchanged. Planetary behavior governs climate, and climate governs civilization. What ancient observers understood intuitively, we model computationally. Yet intuition carries something models do not: reverence. Awareness that disruption is not personal, but patterned. The unsettling possibility is that ancient sky knowledge was not merely observational, but anticipatory. That alignments and calendars were designed not just to track time, but to warn of thresholds, of moments when cycles converge and instability follows. If so, then the repetition of celestial symbolism across cultures is not coincidence, it is inheritance. A shared understanding passed forward through collapse, re-encoded when precision could not be maintained. The sky, unlike libraries or cities, cannot be burned. It cannot be conquered. It offers continuity when everything else fractures. This may be why ancient civilizations invested so heavily in astronomical memory. They trusted the sky more than the ground, more than kings, more than walls. In a resetting world, this trust is pragmatic. Modern civilization, for all its technology, has drifted from this orientation. Light pollution hides the stars. Clocks replace seasons. Time is abstracted, segmented, monetized. We no longer watch the sky for meaning. We consult screens. This detachment carries a cost. When cycles return, they will not announce themselves through calendars we no longer read. If ancient astronomy is the memory of prior resets, then its persistence is not accidental. It is a thread running through collapse, reminding survivors where they stand in a much larger rhythm. The stars do not predict the future, they repeat the past. What they offer is not certainty, but context. If civilization truly resets every 12,000 years, then the sky has already witnessed this many times. It has seen worlds rise, fall, and rise again without commentary. The question is not whether the heavens will change. It is whether we will remember how to listen when they do. Patterns rarely announce themselves as warnings. They prefer subtlety. They surface first as inconvenience, as anomalies brushed aside because they do not yet threaten identity. Only later, when they begin to converge, do they acquire the weight of omen. If cycles govern collapse, then signs do not arrive as prophecy. They arrive as repetition. Long before the end of the last great climatic transition, the Earth began to behave differently. Ice cores reveal instability before rupture. Temperature swings sharpen. Dust increases. Ocean circulation hesitates, then lurches. These changes do not destroy civilization instantly. They unsettle it. They erode predictability, the quiet foundation upon which complexity rests. Civilizations do not fall when they are weak. They fall when they are rigid. One of the earliest signals of systemic stress is synchronization. Events that were once local begin to occur globally. Droughts align across continents. Floods intensify in distant regions simultaneously. Ecosystems respond in chorus rather than isolation. This synchronization is not coincidence. It reflects deeper drivers, shifts in planetary systems that operate beyond political boundaries. In the archaeological record, periods preceding collapse show similar symptoms. Food systems become vulnerable, trade routes overstretch. Centralized authority tightens control in response to uncertainty. Knowledge becomes standardized. Dissent is framed as threat rather than inquiry. These behaviors are not signs of decay, they are signs of protection. Societies attempting to preserve themselves under stress instinctively simplify. They favor stability over exploration. They narrow acceptable narratives. In doing so, they lose flexibility, the very quality required to survive disruption. Environmental signals intertwine with cultural ones. Artistic expression darkens. Myths shift from creation to judgment. Rituals emphasize appeasement. Time is no longer celebrated, it is feared. Calendars become tools of anxiety rather than orientation. In the late Bronze Age collapse, multiple civilizations across the Eastern Mediterranean fell within decades. Climate stress, seismic activity, migration, and systemic fragility converged. The world did not end. It thinned. Cities emptied. Writing vanished in some regions for centuries. Complexity retreated. What survived was not what was strongest, but what was adaptable. If civilization resets on longer cycles, then the signs preceding those resets would be scaled versions of the same pattern. Not apocalypse, but alignment. Not sudden annihilation, but cascading strain. In our own era, signals accumulate quietly. Climate variability intensifies. Ocean currents slow. Ice melts unevenly. Species disappear at accelerating rates. These changes alone do not end civilization, but they erode the margins. At the same time, cultural systems strain under information overload. Narratives fracture. Consensus dissolves. Institutions struggle to maintain coherence. History becomes contested terrain rather than shared memory. The present feels unstable not because it is uniquely dangerous, but because it is approaching a threshold. Thresholds are not lines. They are zones. What makes thresholds dangerous is not ignorance, but misinterpretation. Early warning signs are often reframed as isolated crises rather than connected symptoms. Each problem is addressed separately, preventing recognition of the pattern they form together. In ancient traditions, signs of impending change were often framed cosmologically. Eclipses, comets, irregular seasons. These were not causes but signals. They indicated that the world's rhythm was shifting. The response was not panic, but ritual, an attempt to realign human behaviour with the destabilising cosmos. Modern civilization has lost the language of ritual without fully replacing its function. Data tells us what is happening, but not how to integrate it meaningfully. We quantify disruption while remaining emotionally unprepared for its implications. If cycles exist, then awareness alone does not halt them. The Earth does not negotiate. It responds to energy, mass, and motion. Human systems must adapt or fracture. The most unsettling sign may not be environmental at all, but psychological. A growing sense that continuity is fragile, that systems once trusted feel provisional, that permanence is an illusion maintained by momentum rather than certainty. This sensation appears in literature, film, and philosophy long before collapse becomes measurable. Art senses instability before science can model it. Anxiety is the cultural echo of systemic stress. In prior ages, such unease was interpreted as moral decline or divine displeasure. Today it is framed as existential dread. The language changes, the feeling remains. If civilization is approaching another reset, it will not arrive with a single cataclysmic event. It will arrive as convergence, many manageable problems aligning into an unmanageable whole. Those living through the transition will not recognize it as a reset. They will call it crisis, adaptation, transformation. Only later, when continuity is thinned enough to be obvious, will it acquire a name. This is how resets hide. They disguise themselves as complexity. The Earth does not end worlds. It reorganizes them. Life continues. Humans persist. What changes is the density of memory, the reach of coordination, the scale of ambition. The question is not whether signs exist. It is whether signs are meant to be read as prevention or preparation. If the past teaches anything, it is that not all knowledge is meant to preserve what is. Some knowledge exists to soften what comes next. And perhaps the most difficult sign to interpret is this: the growing realization that civilization itself may be cyclical, and that recognizing the pattern does not grant escape, but responsibility. Responsibility not to stop the cycle, but to decide what, if anything, is worth carrying through it. If cycles are real, then the present is never neutral. It is a position, a point on a curve that is already bending, whether we acknowledge it or not. To ask where we are now is not to predict an ending, but to locate ourselves within a motion that has been underway long before names were given to it. 12,000 years is not an exact clock. It is an approximation, a breathing interval rather than a deadline. The last major climatic rupture did not occur on a single day. It unfolded across centuries of instability before snapping into a new configuration. What matters is not the number itself, but the recurrence of thresholds. By most estimates, modern civilization sits roughly at the far end of the current interglacial period. Ice cores show that we are nearing the upper range of temperature stability seen in previous cycles. Sea levels rise not as catastrophe, but as persistence. Glaciers retreat unevenly, responding to feedback loops that do not reverse easily. From a geological perspective, this is not unusual. From a civilizational one, it is unprecedented. Never before has a single species built a global system so dependent on stable climate. Never before has infrastructure stretched so tightly across coastlines, supply chains, and energy gradients. Never before has knowledge been so centralized and so ephemeral. We often imagine collapse as dramatic: fire, flood, impact. But more often, collapse is logistical. Ports become unreliable. Agriculture shifts faster than institutions can adapt. Migration accelerates beyond political imagination. The system strains, not because it is poorly designed, but because it was designed for a narrower range of conditions. The present moment carries the familiar signs seen before past disruptions: synchronization of crises, narrowing of narratives, polarization of memory. These are not moral failures, they are stress responses. When faced with instability, societies tend to double down on identity. They define themselves more sharply, draw boundaries more rigidly, defend stories more aggressively. This feels like strength. It is often fragility in disguise. If previous civilizations face similar thresholds, they may not have known what they were experiencing either. From within the moment, the world does not feel cyclical. It feels immediate, urgent, singular. Only from a distance does pattern emerge. The modern fixation on apocalypse may be a misreading of something quieter. Not an ending, but a thinning, a gradual loss of redundancy, a narrowing of tolerance for error. The system continues to function until it doesn't, and the reason is not one thing, but many. Technology complicates this picture. It offers buffers against disruption while simultaneously increasing dependence. It accelerates adaptation in some areas and amplifies vulnerability in others. It preserves information while making it less embodied. If civilization resets, technology does not prevent it. It reshapes its texture. The question then becomes not whether we are next, but what next even means. A reset does not erase humanity. It alters scale. It changes what is possible to coordinate. It redistributes memory unevenly. Those who survive do not do so because they are superior, but because they are positioned differently. Inland rather than coastal, flexible rather than specialized, redundant rather than optimized. Optimization is efficient in stable systems. It is lethal in unstable ones. Modern civilization is optimized to a degree unseen in history. Just-in-time logistics, centralized energy grids, specialized labor. These are triumphs and liabilities. They assume continuity. If earlier cycles taught anything, it is that continuity is never guaranteed. This does not mean the present is doomed. It means it is transitional. And transitions are uncomfortable because they resist narrative closure. They do not announce what they are becoming. We stand perhaps in the late afternoon of a long cycle, not at dusk yet, but no longer at dawn. The light is still strong, but it behaves differently. Shadows lengthen, contrast sharpens. What we choose to build in this light matters. If past civilizations left stone because it endures, what do we leave? Digital traces that vanish without power, plastics that outlast usefulness but not meaning, satellites orbiting silently long after their makers forget why they were launched. Our monuments are not designed to teach survivors. They are designed to serve the present. This is not arrogance, it is assumption. The most unsettling possibility is that resets do not punish hubris. They ignore it. The Earth does not respond to belief. It responds to physics. If we are approaching another threshold, then preparation does not look like escape. There is no leaving the cycle. There is only deciding how to pass through it. Do we preserve knowledge in forms that can survive fragmentation? Do we teach adaptability rather than dominance? Do we accept impermanence without surrendering meaning? Ancient societies answered these questions through myth, ritual, and stone. Modern civilization answers them through policy, technology, and data. Both are fragile in different ways. Perhaps the most important decision is not how to prevent a reset, but how to soften it, how to ensure that what comes after is not forced to rebuild from silence alone. If we are next, then next is not a date. It is a process already unfolding. The cycle does not wait for agreement. It moves quietly, beneath calendars and headlines, carrying us forward whether we recognize the curve or insist on the line. And the question that remains is not whether we can stop what is coming. It is whether, when the moment passes, something of us will still be able to remember why we were here. When civilizations end, they do not announce themselves as endings. They soften. They loosen their grip on certainty. Meaning becomes quieter, more personal, less anchored to grand structures. What dissolves first is not buildings, but confidence, the unspoken belief that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough to plan for it. If this is the final movement of a long cycle, it does not arrive with spectacle. It arrives with subtle rearrangements, memory fragments, attention scatters, the future shortens. People begin to live closer to the present, not out of mindfulness, but necessity. The Earth has passed through many such moments without pause. Ice advanced and retreated. Seas swallowed land and released it again. Forests migrated, species adapted or vanished. Through it all, life persisted, not by resisting change, but by yielding to it in pieces. Civilization, however, is less flexible than life. It requires agreement, coordination. Shared stories about how the world works and where it is going. When those stories fracture, the system does not collapse immediately. It drifts. Drift is difficult to recognize because it feels like motion without direction, rather than disaster. People sense loss without knowing what was lost. Nostalgia blooms for eras that were never as stable as remembered. Myths of golden ages multiply. Progress becomes suspicious. Decline becomes fashionable. These are not signs of failure. They are signs of transition. If the cycle is real, then this moment is not unique. Others have stood here before, not knowing they were standing at an edge, only feeling that the ground beneath them behaved differently. They looked to the past for reassurance and found only fragments. They looked to the future and saw fog. What they did next shaped what survived. Some turned inward. They preserved rituals, languages, and practices not because they were efficient, but because they carried meaning compactly. Others turned outward, expanding until expansion itself became unsustainable. Both responses appear in the archaeological record, layered atop one another like choices made under pressure. What endures through resets is not power, but pattern. Not dominance, but adaptability. Not scale, but coherence. Civilizations that collapse violently leave little behind. Those that thin gradually leave more, not because they are better, but because they have time to compress memory into survivable forms. This is perhaps the quiet lesson hidden beneath the cycle, that collapse is not binary. It is granular, and granularity allows choice. The question, then, is not whether the cycle can be escaped. It cannot. The Earth does not offer exemptions. The question is whether awareness alters the texture of passage. Awareness does not stop glaciers. It does not steady oceans. It does not calm the sun or still the axis of the planet, but it changes what is carried forward. A civilization that believes itself eternal builds monuments to itself. A civilization that suspects impermanence builds vessels for meaning. The difference is subtle, but decisive. Perhaps this is why ancient cultures invested so deeply in myth, ritual, and skywatching. They did not expect continuity. They expected recurrence. Their work was not to prevent endings, but to frame them. Modern civilization has framed itself as culmination. This framing makes any hint of reset feel like failure rather than transition. It breeds fear rather than preparation. Yet fear is inefficient. It scatters attention. It clings to form rather than essence. If another reset approaches, slow or sudden, it will not ask whether we believe in it. It will not negotiate with narratives. It will simply change the conditions under which civilization operates. What matters then is not survival alone, but coherence. Whether the fragments left behind still point towards something meaningful. Whether the next builders inherit only ruins, or also orientation. Stone was one answer. Story was another. The sky was a third. Our answers may be different, but the need is the same. The final irony of cycles is that they do not erase humanity's effort. They test its humility. Each iteration reveals whether intelligence has learned to coexist with impermanence, or whether it insists on permanence at all costs. Perhaps the most dangerous belief is not that collapse is coming, but that it has never come before. And perhaps the most hopeful possibility is not that this cycle can be stopped, but that this time something essential is carried through with greater clarity. Not technologies that demand infrastructure, but values that travel lightly. Not systems that require scale, but understanding that survives reduction. If there is a future after this present, and history suggests there always is, it will not remember us by our achievements alone. It will remember what we chose to preserve when preservation was difficult. In that sense, the cycle is not cruel. It is indifferent, and indifference leaves room for intention. The Earth will continue its rhythm long after this chapter quiets. Ice will return, seas will shift, skies will realign. And somewhere, eventually, someone will look at what remains and wonder who came before. They will piece together fragments. They will misinterpret some things. They will mythologize others. They will begin again, believing as we once did that they stand at the beginning. What they will not know, lest we choose carefully now, is that they are standing in the middle of a long remembering. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the purpose of civilization is not to last forever. Perhaps it is to learn how to pass something fragile, intact, through the silence between cycles, and trust that even in forgetting, something essential finds a way to endure. When civilizations end, they do not announce themselves as endings. They soften. They loosen their grip on certainty. Meaning becomes quieter, more personal, less anchored to grand structures. What dissolves first is not buildings, but confidence. The unspoken belief that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough to plan for it. If this is the final movement of a long cycle, it does not arrive with spectacle. It arrives with subtle rearrangements, memory fragments, attention scatters, the future shortens. People begin to live closer to the present, not out of mindfulness, but necessity. The Earth has passed through many such moments without pause. Ice advanced and retreated. Seas swallowed land and released it again. Forests migrated. Species adapted or vanished. Through it all, life persisted, not by resisting change, but by yielding to it in pieces. Civilization, however, is less flexible than life. It requires agreement, coordination, shared stories about how the world works and where it is going. When those stories fracture, the system does not collapse immediately. It drifts. Drift is difficult to recognize because it feels like motion without direction rather than disaster. People sense loss without knowing what was lost. Nostalgia blooms for eras that were never as stable as remembered. Myths of golden ages multiply. Progress becomes suspicious. Decline becomes fashionable. These are not signs of failure. They are signs of transition. If the cycle is real, then this moment is not unique. Others have stood here before, not knowing they were standing at an edge, only feeling that the ground beneath them behaved differently. They looked to the past for reassurance, and found only fragments. They looked to the future and saw fog. What they did next shaped what survived. Some turned inward. They preserved rituals, languages, and practices not because they were efficient, but because they carried meaning compactly. Others turned outward, expanding until expansion itself became unsustainable. Both responses appear in the archaeological record, layered atop one another like choices made under pressure. What endures through resets is not power, but pattern, not dominance, but adaptability, not scale, but coherence. Civilizations that collapse violently leave little behind. Those that thin gradually leave more, not because they are better, but because they have time to compress memory into survivable forms. This is perhaps the quiet lesson hidden beneath the cycle, that collapse is not binary. It is granular, and granularity allows choice. The question, then, is not whether the cycle can be escaped. It cannot. The Earth does not offer exemptions. The question is whether awareness alters the texture of passage. Awareness does not stop glaciers. It does not steady oceans. It does not calm the sun or still the axis of the planet. But it changes what is carried forward. A civilization that believes itself eternal builds monuments to itself. A civilization that suspects impermanence builds vessels for meaning. The difference is subtle, but decisive. Perhaps this is why ancient cultures invested so deeply in myth, ritual, and skywatching. They did not expect continuity. They expected recurrence. Their work was not to prevent endings, but to frame them. Modern civilization has framed itself as culmination. This framing makes any hint of reset feel like failure rather than transition. It breeds fear rather than preparation. Yet fear is inefficient. It scatters attention. It clings to form rather than essence. If another reset approaches, slow or sudden, it will not ask whether we believe in it. It will not negotiate with narratives. It will simply change the conditions under which civilization operates. What matters then is not survival alone, but coherence. Whether the fragments left behind still point towards something meaningful. Whether the next builders inherit only ruins or also orientation. Stone was one answer, story was another, the sky was a third. Our answers may be different, but the need is the same. The final irony of cycles is that they do not erase humanity's effort. They test its humility. Each iteration reveals whether intelligence has learned to coexist with impermanence or whether it insists on permanence at all costs. Perhaps the most dangerous belief is not that collapse is coming, but that it has never come before, and perhaps the most hopeful possibility is not that this cycle can be stopped, but that this time something essential is carried through with greater clarity. Not technologies that demand infrastructure, but values that travel lightly. Not systems that require scale, but understanding that survives reduction. If there is a future after this present, and history suggests there always is, it will not remember us by our achievements alone. It will remember what we chose to preserve when preservation was difficult. In that sense, the cycle is not cruel. It is indifferent, and indifference leaves room for intention. The earth will continue its rhythm long after this chapter quiets. Ice will return, seas will shift, skies will realign, and somewhere, eventually, someone will look at what remains and wonder who came before. They will piece together fragments. They will misinterpret some things. They will mythologize others. They will begin again, believing as we once did that they stand at the beginning. What they will not know, unless we choose carefully now, is that they are standing in the middle of a long remembering, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the purpose of civilization is not to last forever. Perhaps it is to learn how to pass something fragile intact through the silence between cycles, and trust that even in forgetting, something essential finds a way to endure.